Thank you, Brother Aaron, for your prayer, and Brother Kirk for leading us in those songs. To begin with this morning, Rob and I are going to take a few minutes to talk about the idea of becoming faithful followers. This is a scene that is not unfamiliar to any of us. I remember as a kid, the phone that we had in our house was on a party line. And the little community had a little switchboard where you called the operator. To now, we just carry our phones with us wherever we go. I bet if we were to take a poll, there's probably vastly more number of people with a phone on them this morning. But sometimes our phones can be distracting. And sometimes they might take us someplace that we might prefer not to go. In fact, this has brought about a new fear that has been added. It's called nomophobia. No mobile phone phobia. Fear of being without service, being without power, or even for some people being out of sight of their phone. When it comes to leadership, I'd like for us to look at this short passage in 1 Peter chapter 5. And it's interesting, it was interesting to me to think about this because here is a passage that I normally think of as talking to leaders. Here's qualities that a good leader needs to develop as you read through these 4 verses. But actually, when I got to thinking about it more, it was interesting to think on the idea that God can teach us how to be good followers by teaching us leadership qualities, leadership traits. God is looking for men who will step forward and lead God's people in a godly way. And we may not hold a particular office of elder or deacon in a congregation, but each one of us has an influence. Each one of us can lead by just living our lives. There are 3 things in Peter's address to his fellow elders in these verses that I think are interesting. One is willingness. He says in verse 2, "Shepherd the flock of God which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly." A person cannot be driven into an office of leadership. He should not take such an office if his desire is for status or popularity or presence within a congregation. You can't be made a follower against your will, screaming and kicking all the way. But when Peter is talking to the elders here in 1 Peter chapter 5, you get the idea of these men having a desire to serve, like Jesus came as a servant. A deep commitment, track record of spiritual maturity. These are qualities that show the willingness in a person to step forward and to be a leader. The second quality that I noted here is in the last part of verse 2, not for dishonest gain, but eagerly. One of my favorite stories about Phillips Brooks, he was a 19th century Episcopal minister in Boston. Probably one of the most popular ministers in Massachusetts during his day. But the story is told that he was walking down Boylston Street in Boston on, it was the first day of April. And he happened to notice up ahead that this young boy was running up the steep steps to an expensive-looking townhouse. And as Brooks was walking down the street, he saw this little boy at the door reaching and straining for the bell ringer for the door, which was just barely out of his grasp. So the preacher decided he'd help him out. He made his way up to the doorpost, and he said to the young man, see if I can help you. And so he turned the knob, and he heard the bell ringing on the other side of the door. And he looked down at the little boy, and the little boy then darted down the steps as quick as he could and said, "Run like crazy." So if there's anything that we could say about Phillips Brooks, I know that there's at least one occasion where he knew what it was like to follow an enthusiastic and motivated leader. If you have the blessing of being able to follow a man who is motivated and who has that enthusiasm to serve the Lord, it's a wonderful thing. But when Peter talks about this enthusiasm, he couches it against not for dishonest gain. I thought that was interesting. We live in a world where some people will do anything for money. Legal, illegal, under the table, any way that they think they might be able to get away from it. But when it comes to being leaders in the Lord's church, we need men who will be willing to do anything for the Lord. That sacrificial desire to serve, that desire to please God, and that desire to serve within God's kingdom. A third trait that comes out in verse 3, nor being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. Not motivated by pride, but striving to be an example of humility. As we read on a little bit further beyond these 4 verses, it's interesting that this seems to be the thing that resonates with Peter as he leaves these instructions and encourages these men. In verse 5, he says, "Likewise, you younger people, submit yourself to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you." Peter is an apostle. Peter walked with Jesus. Peter witnesses the miracles that Jesus performed. Peter stood with Jesus as he ascended back to heaven. Peter was inspired. Peter worked miracles, preached God's word across the land, was a wonderful example of leader. And yet, he leaves us here as he talks with these elders, stressing the importance of humility. Humility is so important because humility punctuates our influence. Humility illustrates what it really means to be a follower of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 16 and in verse 24, Matthew records Jesus in these familiar words, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." 3 great traits of leaders. There has been, over the last few months, some considerable interest in a movie that I think is available on one of the streaming services called Bird Box. And in this movie, the characters blindfold themselves and try to navigate through land and across water. And this has brought about one of these silly at first, but really dangerous challenges that have been picked up on social media like YouTube, and where people try to imitate. And in January of this year in Utah, a couple of high school girls driving down a road in a pickup truck, and the driver had the bright idea of, well, let's take up this challenge. And she pulled down her bandana over her eyes while she was driving, crashed into a car driven by an elderly man. And it reminds me of how people will blindly walk through life, especially in this world that has the influence of the prince of the power of the air, and follow blindly, obliviously, to their own hurt. We need leaders in the Lord's church. We need leaders in our pews. We need leaders in our homes. So I come back to this passage in 1 Peter chapter 5. And I think as I look back on this passage, this is a passage that talks about elders. He's addressing the elders. He's talking about leadership. But if you look at this passage from just a slightly different perspective, there is an inspired inference in these verses that I think to me is very challenging. And I hope that you'll find it so yourself. In verse 4, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. Now, the text doesn't specifically say this, but if Jesus is the chief shepherd, then that makes the elder an under shepherd. Or there's another way to say it. It makes the elder a follower. Yes. The very first, and I think the most important aspect of being a faithful follower is being a person who follows Christ, yes, first and foremost. So if we have shepherds who are following Jesus, then we can know with certainty that we're safe to follow them. Brother Rob's going to pick up and continue our thoughts on this morning.